and welcome to our program Where God Weeps, a program where we talk about the suffering church around the world. Persecution of Christians, religious freedom, martyrs of the 20th and 21st centuries are topics that appear more and more in the international media. Quite often, these news outlets quote data and information from the book The Global War on Christians. Today, it is my privilege to welcome to our program Mr. John Allen, a world-known journalist and author of this important book. John, thank you for being with us today.
It's a pleasure, Jonas.
John, I would like to start our conversation very directly to the title of your book, because that's going to give us the opportunity to go into these very different topics. First of all, why are you talking about global? The title is Global War on Christians.
Well, the first point is that Christianity today is a global brand. There are 2.3 billion Christians in the world, 2/3 of whom live outside the West. They live in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, and Oceania. So we are truly a global family of faith. And this phenomenon of anti-Christian persecution is also a global reality. I know if you look at the news media, you would think it's localized to the Middle East. But this simply isn't true. It happens in Southeast Asia. Statistically speaking, one of the most dangerous places on the planet to be a Christian today is actually India. There's an average of one violent attack against a Christian every other day. The most dangerous place on earth to be a Catholic priest for the last 2 decades has been Colombia in Latin America, where the violence is directed largely by drug gangs and terrorists. One of the largest state persecutors of Christians is China. So, this is truly Christianity is a global faith. And the suffering of Christians is a global reality. Therefore, the only word for it is global.
In your introduction, you talk about war, and you are very thorough in the explanation of why you want to use that specific term.
Well, the truth of it is, as an American, I don't like the word war, because we Americans call everything a war. Going all the way back to the war on poverty under LBJ, and now we talk about a war on women and a war on Christmas and, all kinds of other things. And it's one of the most overheated words in politics. It basically shuts down conversation, because if you've got a political challenge, maybe you can find a compromise. If you're in a war, the only solution is total victory. And so I don't like that overused term. That said, in this specific set of circumstances, I think it applies. Because when I talk about anti-Christian persecution, I am not primarily talking about church-state wrangles in a courthouse someplace. I'm talking about Christians who literally take their lives in their hands every time they go to Mass, every time they open their business, or for that matter, every time they walk down the street. We're talking about a scourge of lethal violence directed at a specific religious community. And when we're talking about a systematic global wave of violence, I think the only word for it is war.
And finally, is it really anti-Christian? Meaning, is it a hate attitude towards believers of Jesus Christ?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Christians are not the only community that's suffering. There are many, many other oppressed religious communities in the world today, too. And if a defense of religious freedom is going to mean anything, it can't be a parochial exercise. It can't be just for Christians, but it has to be religious freedom across the board. That said, there is specific anti-Christian hatred out there that is increasingly lethal and increasingly widespread. And the reason I focus on the suffering of Christians in particular, first of all, because statistically speaking, Christians are the most oppressed religious community in the world today, in part because they are the largest, 2.3 billion people, that's 1/3 of the human population. And Christianity's greatest zones of growth today are outside the West in some fairly dangerous neighborhoods in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of the Middle East and Southeast Asia. I think the other reason for this specific focus on Christians is that, in my experience, Christians are the lone religious community that has a very hard time getting the story of its suffering heard. Because in the West, we are so accustomed to thinking of Christianity as the big kid on the block, the largest, most powerful, wealthiest religious institution, that it's very hard for many Europeans or Americans to get their minds around the fact that Christians actually can be persecuted. If you say religious persecution to the typical American, they're going to think about the Crusades and the Inquisition and the Salem witch trials, all chapters of history in which Christians basically were the bad guys.
Persecutors.
You know, they don't think automatically about the Boko Haram or the disappearing Christian community in Iraq or the suffering church in China. And it's that wall of silence we need to break. And if talking about a global war on Christians is the way to ring the bell, then frankly, I think it's about time we rang it. Now,
you also mention and make a very clear distinction between this hate for Western culture and this synonymous that some cultures have about Christianity and the Western culture. Why it is not just specifically that?
Well, I mean, the truth of it is, over the centuries, Christianity often has been primarily a Western faith. I mean, at the beginning of the 20th century, 2/3 of the Christian population in the world lived in the West, primarily in Europe. You know, you go back a century before that, it was 80% or more. So it's a natural identification that a lot of people around the world make. However, it does not do justice to the Christian map today. 2/3 of those 2.3 billion Christians today live in the Southern Hemisphere. That share is going to be 3/4 by mid-century. And often, these people who are being persecuted because they are alleged beachheads for the West have actually been in these places longer than their persecutors. I mean, you look at the church in Iraq, that church has roots that go back to the 1st century, 7 centuries older than Islam. So the notion that the Chaldean Christians in Iraq are somehow a foreign implant is totally fallacious. But, you know, in the politics of the early 21st century, it's an easy sell for some radicals to make to say that Christianity equals the West and therefore it has to be opposed.
Now, what about hate to the church because it's outspoken about human rights?
Well, look, I mean, if we were to start, you know, ticking off the laundry list of reasons for which Christians are sometimes persecuted, it's a very lengthy one. It is true that sometimes the church's role as a voice of conscience, a tribune of the people, gets it into some hot water, whether the target would be radical groups in a particular neighborhood or corrupt regimes. You know, in Latin America during the 70s and 80s, you've got a long list of martyrs who spoke out against authoritarian police states, the most famous being Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador. In sub-Saharan Africa, there's a very long list of known and unknown Christian victims who have resisted the brutality of authoritarian states and acted in defense of human rights. So certainly, the church's social teaching and the courage with which many Christians on the ground stand in defense of that social teaching is one on a sadly very long list of factors that sometimes puts them in the firing line.
You have a very thorough list about ways this persecution is happening. Can you give me some examples, specific examples about these different categories? Social discrimination.
Well, I mean, social discrimination would be when the social deck is stacked against a particular religious community, in this case, Christians. So, I mean, to give you one concrete example, and this kind of blows people's minds, but the truth of it is, there is a very rapidly growing Christian community inside Saudi Arabia. I mean, the estimate today is that there are about 1.5 million Catholics alone inside Saudi Arabia, among which, by the way, 1.3 million of them are Filipinos.
Yes.
They're the new Irish. You know, you can't go anywhere in the world without finding Filipino Catholics. But those people are largely domestic servants or they're working in the oil industries. The path to citizenship is totally shut down to them, even if they've been in the country for a lifetime, even if they're raising children there. They have no right to citizenship. Therefore, they are permanent second-class citizens. They have no right to public worship. They have to go to Mass on the grounds of the oil industry compounds or at Western embassies. They can't wear religious insignia. If their religious affiliation is known to their employers, they're often discriminated against because of it, and because they're not citizens, they have no right. You know, the police aren't going to help them, the courts aren't going to help them, and so on. So the social deck basically is set up to make sure that they remain a permanent underclass. Okay, that's an example of social discrimination.
What about institutional discrimination?
Well, institutional discrimination would be when the state is overtly hostile to a religious community, again, in this case, Christians. So China would be a classic example. Where officially speaking, it is legal to be Christians, and there are, in fact, state-created bodies, both for Protestants and Catholics, in which if you want to be above ground, you were obligated by law to take part in these kind of rump churches that have been set up by the Chinese government. But if you want to remain loyal to your church, for example, if you're Catholic and therefore you want to remain loyal to the Pope, you're driven into a kind of catacomb existence. In most parts of China, you're kind of grudgingly tolerated, but there is absolutely nothing that would prevent state officials from subjecting you to harassment, arbitrarily detaining you, seizing your religious articles, throwing you in jail if they want to. And there are, of course, some Catholic bishops and Catholic clergy and lay believers in China who have spent the better part of 10, 20, 30, even 40 years behind bars for their refusal to go along with this kind of state-orchestrated charade. So that's institutional discrimination.
Why do you make a different category of legal discrimination? What would be an example of legal discrimination?
Well, there are some countries in the Middle East, for example, where things, for example, you can't be elected to parliament if you're not a member of the majority religion, in most cases, if you're a Muslim. Where access to certain officer ranks in the armed forces are shut off. Access to senior levels in finance and industry are denied to you, and so on. In other words, where there are actual de jure laws that prevent Christians from exercising their full rights as citizens.
Suppression of conversion to Christianity, meaning you are not allowed to become a Christian?
Yeah, I mean, for example, in many Middle Eastern nations, there are blasphemy laws which overtly, as they've been interpreted by Islamic jurisprudence, overtly prevent someone from renouncing Islam and embracing another faith. And there are usually both legal and social consequences for doing so. Legally, you can be charged with a crime. Socially, you are typically ostracized and persecuted and so on.
I think that one of the most interesting parts of the book, John, is the fact that you gather a lot of information from different sources and then you analyze it. But one of the numbers that is really staggering is when you mention that 70 million martyrs have died since the times of Jesus Christ. And out of those 70 million, 45 million have happened in the 21st and 20th century. We come to a total of 100,000 to 150,000 new Christian martyrs every year.
Well, that number comes from the Center for the Study of Global Christianity in the States, run by a scholar by the name of Todd Johnson. We should say it's a debated number. I mean, there are other experts who think it's too high. But I usually put it this way. The high-end estimate for the number of Christian martyrs in the early 21st century is 100,000 every year. The low-end estimate is somewhere closer to 7,000, 8,000. Which means there's either one new Christian martyr every minute or there's one new Christian martyr every hour. Now, whichever one it is, it's grotesque, and it's a scourge of staggering proportions. I think the reason that these numbers have a hard time setting in, is that if we look at media coverage of anti-Christian persecution, we will cover these occasional spectacular outbursts. If there's a bombing of a church in Baghdad that kills 50 people or 100 people, we'll cover that. If there's a Boko Haram assault on a couple of churches in Nigeria, we'll cover that. But the kind of day in, day out, one person here, two people there sort of body count that goes on every day of every week of every year sort of flies below the radar screen. And one of the things I wanted to accomplish in the book, obviously, is to sort of lift it up and make us reckon with the staggering scope and scale of this problem. You
talk about myths in your book, about things that we believe about persecution of Christians. And I think that's a very interesting analysis that you do. One of them, the first one, Christians are at risk only where they are a minority. Why that is not true?
Well, of the 2.3 billion Christians in the world, somewhere around 200 million live in countries where they're a statistical minority. So look, even if it were true that Christians are only at risk when they're a minority, that would still mean there are 200 million people at risk, which probably ought to get our attention. But the point is, some of the worst anti-Christian violence around the world actually occurs in places where Christians are a majority. For example, the nation of Colombia in Latin America. The Vatican keeps an annual list of what they call pastoral workers, which are priests, nuns, or full-time lay employees of the church who are engaged in some kind of pastoral work. who are killed every year. And every year, the country at the top of that list is Colombia, which is 95% Catholic. And yet, it is also a place where vast stretches of the country functionally are not under the control of the state. They're under the control of paramilitary groups, which are now basically narco-terrorists. Back in the day, they used to be Marxist terrorists, but today they basically act as a kind of mercenary entrepreneurial force with, with alliances with drug gangs and so on, drug cartels. And they don't like the stands in defense of human rights and against the drug trade that a lot of Catholic pastoral workers engage in. The same thing could be said of parts of Mexico, so other parts of Latin America, parts of sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, the point is that simply living in a culture where Christianity is a statistical majority is no guarantee that individual Christians are going to be safe.
Another myth, it's all about Islam, isn't it?
Well, listen, let's not be in denial about anything, okay? Radical Islam is the world's leading manufacturer of anti-Christian hatred, okay? There is no doubt that in the world's 57 majority Muslim states, in an unfortunate majority of them, there are radical currents in Islam that explicitly target Christians and often do so violently. So I don't mean to play down the threat posed by radical Islam. You'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind in the era of the Islamic State to miss the point. But that said, radical Islam could fall off the face of the earth tomorrow, and that would not mean that Christians suddenly are no longer in the firing line. I mean, in many other parts of the world, the threats come from other sources. For example, the most violent anti-Christian pogrom of the last 25 years wasn't anywhere in the Middle East. It was in the northeastern Indian state of Orissa in 2008, when machete-wielding radicals set upon a number of Christian villages. They killed about 500 people, they injured thousands, tens of thousands, had to take refuge for a month in a nearby forest. Hundreds of Christian homes, businesses, schools, social service centers were burned to the ground and are still destroyed. And in that case, it wasn't radical Muslims, it was radical Hindus who were leading the rampage. There are other parts of the world, such as China, Vietnam, Myanmar, where the threat comes from an authoritarian police state that is overtly hostile to Christianity. So, unfortunately, it would be much easier if there were a single bad guy to this story, but the truth is, the list of villains is depressingly long.
Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to cover all these myths that you talk about in your book, but I do want to talk about the one that says it's only persecution if the motives are religious. Why is that a myth?
Well, historically, if we look at this through the lens of the Catholic Church, the Catholic test for martyrdom has always been that you have to be killed in odium fidei, an explicit hatred of the faith, okay? And that is theologically the test for martyrdom that the Church uses, and it's fully appropriate for the Church's own purposes. But in terms of public understanding of anti-Christian violence, I think it's way too limited, because basically it puts all the focus on the motives of the persecutor rather than the persecutee. Okay, I mean, let me give you an example. There was a Croatian nun and an Italian lay volunteer who were killed in Burundi about 5 or 6 years ago. They were there working, they were in a region of Burundi that has statistically, according to the UN, the world's highest infection rate of HIV/AIDS. It's the epicenter of the HIV/AIDS crisis. Some of the most forgotten, abandoned, and often despised people on the planet. And these two missionaries felt called by God to be present to them. Now, one night, a band of thieves who didn't hate Christians, they were just looking for stuff to steal, okay, broke into the residence where these people were staying. They killed the nun on sight. They kidnapped the lay volunteer. Then they got involved in a shootout with the police, and this guy got killed in the crossfire. Now, one way of looking at that would be saying, well, this wasn't hatred of Christianity.
There was no
so
faith related.
It's not religious violence. It's not anti-Christian violence. And as a theological examination of martyrdom, that might make some sense. However, in terms of public understanding, I would want to ask a deeper question, which is, why were those two people there in the first place? I mean, what were they doing there? These were smart, college-educated, accomplished people who could have done virtually anything with their lives. They chose to be in one of the most lawless and dangerous pieces of real estate in the world because they felt profoundly in their bones that God had called them to be there. Okay, so in other words, their motives for putting themselves in harm's way had everything to do with their religious beliefs, and to dismiss that as not counting as anti-Christian violence, I think is a travesty.
In your book, you mention the famous quote of Tertulliano, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." What does this mean, John? Are we all condemned to martyrdom? Should we have this ending?
Well, you know, the Catholic Church has always taught that while martyrdom is laudatory, it is not obligatory. You know, I mean, nobody is required to become a martyr. Nobody is required to put themselves in circumstances in which they're likely to be killed. And look, I think we have to do two things at once. Okay, one, we have to honor the stories of the new martyrs. We have to make sure those stories are told. We have to cherish their sacrifice and cherish their memories, not only because it's the morally right thing to do, but because it's the most powerful missionary calling card we've got. You know, martyrdom is Christianity at its most inspiring. It's Christianity stripped of any pretense of power or privilege or kind of institutional weight. And it's pure courage, pure love, pure heroism, seen in its most stark form, and there's something inherently compelling about it. Okay, you know, when I first became interested in the subject of anti-Christian persecution is when John Paul was in Ukraine in 2001, and I was there covering the papal trip. And I remember his last event was in Lviv, and we were out in this airfield where more than 2 million Ukrainians had shown up. And I was at the back of the crowd, and out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of a young woman on her knees by herself in the mud, just crying her eyes out. Okay, and I walked up to her and asked her if she could just share with me what she was feeling. And she told me that her grandfather had been a Greek Catholic priest. Of course, in the Greek Catholic Church, they have a married clergy. And her grandfather, during one of the periods of Soviet oppression of the church in Ukraine, had been arrested and sent off to the Gulag. And he was given a very simple choice between renouncing his faith or being killed. He chose not to renounce his faith. And true to their word, they killed him, but not through the simple expedient of putting a bullet in his head. Instead, they crucified him upside down on a wall in the Gulag in a kind of grotesque parody of the crucifixion, and allowed him to hang there for several days before he died. And what this young woman told me was the reason she was crying is because she was imagining what had to be in her grandfather's heart that day, looking down from heaven and seeing the Holy Father stand on Ukrainian soil. Okay. Now, listen, you got to understand, I grew up in western Kansas in the 70s. Okay. The closest I ever came to suffering for the faith was eating fish sticks and macaroni and cheese on Fridays in Lent. Okay. That was my idea of carrying the cross. What that moment and others like it over the course of my career have brought home for me is that there is something so precious about this faith that in extraordinary circumstances, totally ordinary people who have no aspirations to heroism will pay in blood rather than let it go. And martyrdom brings that truth home in a way that nothing else ever can. So we've got to tell those stories. At the same time, we have to do everything we possibly can to reduce the number of martyrs, because there are far too many people in this world who are exposed to lethal violence simply by virtue of their religious convictions. That is an outrage, and we have to do everything we can, and there are achievable things we can do to try to avoid putting new people at risk. At the same time, we also have to cherish and celebrate the stories of those who have already made the supreme sacrifice.
John, unfortunately, we're running out of time, and I don't want to ask you an unfair question because you don't have a crystal ball and you can foresee the future. But what do you see coming? I mean, is there hope? Can we expect any changes worldwide in this regard?
Well, I think the short-term prognosis is not good. Every statistical measure of religious freedom around the world we have tells us that the situation is getting significantly worse, not significantly better. And so I think the only realistic answer to that question is that in the short term, I think more Christians and more followers of other religions are going to be exposed to severe pressure on their religious freedom. Some of them are going to be physically harassed, and some of them are going to die because of their religious beliefs. Now, at the same time, I also profoundly believe that human history is not like the weather. It is not beyond our control. There are things we can do to affect the trajectory here, to nudge things in one direction or another. And without going into a whole complicated laundry list of things we can do, one simple, achievable step that is easily within the reach of everybody watching this broadcast is to support those organizations out there that do advocacy on behalf of the victims of religious persecution and that also do humanitarian relief for those who are suffering. And while there are a number of great organizations who do this kind of thing, if you'll permit me to mention just one, I would say Aid to the Church in Need is an example of a phenomenal Catholic organization that got to this party early, that has been ringing a bell about the dangers of a worsening climate for religious freedom and threats to Christians in particular for a very long time. They do invaluable work documenting the realities of persecution and also bringing relief to those who need it. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. What we need to do is support organizations like Aid to the Church in Need. You know, we don't have to dream up some new initiative. What we have to do is raise the profile of people who are already doing this work and mobilize ourselves to support them. One great thing about Americans, okay, is it can take us a long time to get engaged on something, but once we do get engaged on something, baby, we are going to see it through. And that's what needs to happen on this issue.
John, thank you so very much for this time, and I hope that we have the opportunity to talk to you again some other time.
I'd love to do it, Jonas. Thanks.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us in another program of Where God Weeps. If you want to learn more about the persecution of Christians around the world, we encourage you to contact information at the end of this program. Thank you, and God bless.